A few weeks ago, I had CPR training, which I've had many times in the past being a teacher. And if you've ever had CPR training, over the years, there's one thing that is obvious, and that is CPR training is always changing based on updated statistics on what procedure works best. The American Heart Association updates those procedures every 5 years. So, here's what I learned the other day. If you see someone who has collapsed, first determine if they are responsive. And if they're not, then immediately call or have someone call 911. If there is an AED machine, like the one we have on the wall over there, retrieve it. Check again for normal breathing, and if that person is still unresponsive, begin CPR. 30 chest compressions to 2 breaths. 15 chest compressions to do 2 breaths was the old way. Things change. Also, what I learned the other day was we only really have a 10-minute window to save someone's life. We have to act very, very quickly. And finally, a very unusual tidbit. In other countries, they train their citizens far better than we do here in the United States. So there is a greater amount of saves. CPR, as we know, stands for cardiopulmonary resuscitation. It's a procedure that attempts to save the brain by attempting to get the heart pumping blood and the lungs to breathe again. So typically we know that CPR is administered when someone has gone into cardiac arrest. So, as I was taking my training the other day, I couldn't help but think about the church. The church seems to be in cardiac arrest these days. Dying may be too strong a word, and yet it seems very obvious to me that Christianity needs CPR. We need our hearts to start pumping. We need our lungs to be filled with a new breath of the Spirit. Sometimes we might even need the equivalent of the AED machine. This is not anything new. For decades, the Church Universal has been in decline. The numbers are going down. In our own Catholic tradition, we've seen parishes closing or consolidating all over the country, and this is due to a decline in attendance. Nationwide, only 24% of Catholics go to church on the weekend, down from 55% in 1965. That's a drastic decline. So, we could spend a lot of time talking about the reasons for this decline, and yet the bottom line is that Christianity has a vitality problem. Its vital signs are not good. It needs church CPR, new life, energy, and spirit. Christianity needs to be resuscitated. The first church CPR technique is prayer. When the prophet Elijah visits the widow from Zarephath, her son becomes so ill, there was no more breath in him. The widow actually believes that Elijah caused her son's death. Elijah takes her son, carries him upstairs, lays him out on the bed, and he cries to the Lord, "O Lord, my God, have you brought calamity upon this widow whom I'm staying by killing her son?" Then, in what looks like an ancient CPR technique, he stretches out his body over the boy, and he begins to cry out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this child's life come back into him again." The Lord revives the child. This sounds like CPR to me. As I said a moment ago, in CPR training, we are taught to call 911 if that person is not responsive. So we know Elijah didn't have access to a 911 operator, but he did have access to God through his cries of help. According to the story, it was the prayer of Elijah that saves the boy's life. Prayer is the first technique we need to employ for CPR on each and every one of our congregations. Prayers get the heart pumping, the lungs breathing, and the brain working. Prayer is the lifeblood of congregational life. Without prayer, the church goes into cardiac arrest. The second church CPR technique is proclamation. The Apostle Paul shares this technique with the Galatians. He claims that he was given the gospel, or the good news of Jesus Christ, through a direct revelation from Jesus. It's not of human origin, says Paul. He then reminds his readers he was once a fierce persecutor of the church until he received God's grace and was called to proclaim the good news among the Gentiles. Now, this was not popular with the Christian leaders in Jerusalem. They believed the gospel should only be shared with the Jews. But Paul knew Christianity would die if the message of the gospel is confined to a particular place or particular group of people. A living, breathing church that proclaims the gospel to everyone, regardless of race, language, sexual orientation, gender, age, abilities, social economic status. One of the things I learned in CPR class is that we're not required to use the breathing technique on people if we're not comfortable doing so. Breathing into that person, if we're not comfortable, we shouldn't do it. I almost find this appalling because if we're serious about saving lives, then we would be doing so. Likewise, a church that limits its proclamation of the gospel only to those it's comfortable with is a dying church. It will soon find itself on life support. Without a habit of inclusive proclamation, a church will lose its breath. Finally, the third CPR technique is compassion. I love that word, compassion. Luke's gospel shares another story of resuscitation of a son of a widow in chapter 17. The setting is a town called Nan. As Jesus enters the city gates, he notices a funeral procession for a dead son. Jesus feels compassion for this mother because without her son, there's no one to care for her. So, similar to Elijah, he performs what I call Jesus CPR. He simply speaks the words, "Young man, I say to you, rise." If only CPR were that simple. So, isn't compassion the one thing missing from many congregations? Most of our congregations pray and proclaim the gospel, but at the end of the day, do they show compassion for whom they're praying and to whom they are proclaiming the good news? And isn't this the most important part of church vitality? So, there's an interesting dynamic at play here. Congregations that are dying need to show compassion for people in need in order to regain their vitality. In order to save ourselves, in other words, we need to save others first. Our life depends on it. Fortunately for the Church Universal, we do have 10 minutes to come back to life. We aren't dead yet, and yet, according to the charts, our vital signs are waning, our blood pressure is dropping, and our breathing capacity is limited. May the Spirit of God breathe new life into the Church Universal, and may we continue to be a congregation of prayer, proclamation, and compassion. Amen.